Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'd like to welcome back Professor Geir Jordet to the show. Geir, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dan. A pleasure to be here again.
Yeah, really looking forward to having another conversation with you. You've been on before, talking all things scanning, which I know is a big part of your research and consulting life. But exciting times. You've released a book about the psychology of the penalty shootouts. So really looking forward to unpacking that with you. But before we do, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm. My name is Geir Jordet, and I am a professor in psychology and football from Oslo, Norway. I have done a lot of research on, like you said, scanning, visual perception, decision making. Spent a few years of my life only looking at penalty kicks, high pressure penalty shootouts. I've studied learning, I've studied body language, communication on the pitch, and I also do quite a bit in practice. A lot of consulting, both with teams, clubs, associations, players. So everything psychology and football is the name of my game.
And as I say, you've written this book with a foreword for none other than Arsene Wenger. And in the introduction to this book, you introduce this subject matter by talking us through your initial interest in penalties, studying penalties, which started back in 2004. I'd love you to tell us a little bit about the early days of studying penalties. I mean, where did this interest come from? And talk to me a little bit about those early days.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I spent quite a bit of time in the introduction of the book unpacking that because there's a lot to be unpacked. And I'm not sure if your listeners are interested in all of that right now. But I mean, I have a personal introduction to it. My own penalty kicking history was horrifying. And I'm sharing that in the introduction. I'm not going to talk about that here now. Then I had a more kind of professional interest in it that was peaked at the Euros in 2004. So 20 years ago, exactly. When I was on a Norwegian radio show of all things, and I found myself in a duel, so to speak, with none other than Henning Berg, the former Manchester United central defender,
Yep.
who had just stepped down from his career playing. I didn't know him at the time. And I said something like this was when David Beckham had just missed a penalty kick in the Euros penalty shootout against Portugal. I said that Beckham could not handle the pressure, I said. And that unleashed a cascade from Henning Berg protecting his teammate, showing me and all the listeners how I was wrong. And he did not use pretty words describing that.
Wow.
And I couldn't tackle it. I had nothing to say to him. I choked almost. I had no reasoning behind what I had said. I didn't have any data. I had nothing to back it up. So I went out of this horrible experience, having been tackled by a Manchester United defender on air, feeling that I needed to do better. And that's actually how it started. And then I moved to the Netherlands back then, started a new job, and I got into doing research on penalty kicks. Got my hands on some really nice data, interviewed players who had taken part in the Euros penalty shootout between Sweden and the Netherlands. Was very fortunate to start to collaborate with the Dutch Football Association, who at the time had a really horrible penalty shootout history themselves. So they were looking for everything they could for external advice, and started a collaboration with them that lasted for 5 years, and did a lot of research, collected a lot of data, and which later on became quite a bit of scientific publications. And 20 years later, I have a book that shows some of the more the biggest conclusions.
Well, we're going to unpack that book now, and perhaps I don't want you to give anything away, but if you could get in a time machine and go back, and you were able to, would you robustly defend yourself against Henning Berg's his own defense of Beckham? Do you think that you were correct about the Beckham assumption?
I absolutely do. Now, now, before I say anything more, I have to say that Henning and I have since become good friends. We've collaborated on multiple occasions, so this is something that we both laugh of now. But back then, I mean, as you or listeners may remember, David Beckham took the first kick in the shootout against Portugal, and Portugal had a goalkeeper who was quite active. He was waiting for David Beckham at the penalty mark. And basically taunting Beckham, putting a finger in his face, and saying some words as well. And Beckham appeared to me as just extremely focused, but that's the good word for it. Another word for it would be very rigid. So his facial demeanor very very stiff. He was very focused on the ball, focused on the spot. But I'm not sure if he was actually as flexibly handling the situation as he could, because he ended up placing the ball very quickly on the penalty mark, not really checking the surface as good as he might have done, because the goalkeeper was standing there. And then when the penalty comes, as people may remember, it went. It seems like it was a few meters above the crossbar, because the grass was loose. He hadn't checked the surface well enough. And I suspect that the goalkeeper's behaviors leading up to that was a big part of why he didn't do that. And that ended up with a miss for Beckham.
This Englishman remembers that well, guys. So thank you for replaying that one in my mind. It was a time when England were really struggling with penalty shootouts, and that landscape is so much better. Not least because of the work of so many great sports psychologists like yourself in this area. I do believe, if I may say so. Well, look, you're speaking to Beckham, perhaps lacking a little bit of behavioural flexibility in that moment, and we're going to speak to that. But let's take a more microscopic look at what he might have been experiencing, and you do this in chapter 1. Experiencing the pressure, where you talk about choking mechanisms, the experience of anxiety, and perhaps what behavioural signatures are associated with anxiety and choking. Can you speak to us a little bit about what you introduced to us in this chapter?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, we kick it off in this book with what the experience of pressure is like, and really looking at some of the mechanisms that may underpin choking or underperforming in the situation. And I mean, the first thing I have to say that this is not simple. It's a penalty kick which might appear very unified, or this discrete simple task, but this is so complex, and there's so many ways, so many different ways that people can underperform in this situation. Now, from our research, from our interviews that we've done, one thing that kind of springs out of that data is that there's one emotion that everyone kind of feels, and that is anxiety. So anxiety is there, and we know that when anxiety is there, that can have a whole lot of different implications. Now you can, of course, interpret this anxiety in a very constructive way, and I mean, I get to that in later chapters when we speak about how to control this event and how to control yourself. But anxiety can cause you to do a lot of things. We see in our studies on behaviors how players historically were doing everything they could to avoid thinking about what's happening, avoid relating to what's happening, by doing things like simply avoiding to look at the goalkeeper.
Right.
So you put the ball on the penalty mark and you step back, and you can do that looking straight ahead, looking at the goalkeeper, or you can turn your back to the goalkeeper. And in the past, the majority of players would turn their back to the goalkeeper. Now, interestingly, the vast majority of English players would do this more than any other country. English players would turn their back to the
Yeah.
goalkeeper. And before I say anything more, I have to say, because I speak about the English, but I mean, I have a strong admiration for English players and English football. And coming from Norway, I just wish that my team was in tournaments so we could get to penalty shootouts. But we're not even in tournaments, and we haven't been for 24 years. So I have to add that to it. But yeah, English players historically, they turn their back on the goalkeepers. Another thing that English players historically do is that they speed up. So they would react to the referee whistle as if it's a starting pistol in a 100-meter race, and instantly run towards the ball. And what our studies show is that in the bigger stress moments, the bigger pressure moments, players tend to speed up. They tend to possibly just want to get the shot over and done with. So that's one potential kind of choking mechanism. But this is not, again, it's not simple, because you can also have the opposite. So what if players then don't take that short time and they start to take really long time? Is it possible to take too long time? And we have examples of that. In the Euros final, the 2020 Euros final, again, an English team involved, my apologies, but Marcus Rashford took 11 seconds to react to the referee's whistle. And in all the 718 shots that we've analyzed to pieces in the World Cup, European Championships, and the Champions League, that's the world record. No one has ever taken as long as Rashford did. And when you look at that shot and you listen to what he said about it afterwards, he would say things that, like, he was feeling a little bit off. He needed the shot to be perfect. He was trying something that he hadn't tried before. And that makes you speculate, but I have to add, this is speculation because I don't know, that he was overthinking a little bit in this situation. And that's another choking mechanism, right? That we know from lots of research, that when you start to explicitly, consciously control what typically is just run automatically without thinking, then that could be a way that you choke. So those are some of the processes that happen, in addition to, ironic processes is quite common in this event, because the one thing that you don't want to do is miss. So you think about not missing, not missing, not missing. And of course, that's what you end up doing. We see a lot of disordered gaze behavior, where we know that quiet eye behavior is something that characterizes players when they do these type of discrete tasks, when they have a very still moment with their visual gaze right leading up to the shot or the performance. And when you see players with their gaze basically all over the place, that's the opposite, and that could be also be a sign of a cognitive process that has gone awry, and that a player is about to choke.
It's so interesting for me listening to you, Guy, talking about this opening chapter, because as a former professional golfer, and having been a golf coach and worked heavily in golf as a sports psychologist, the parallels. One reason why I've been so into the psychology of penalty kicks is because of the parallels between that sort of dead ball situation that you get so many times in a round in golf. It feels very similar, and everything that you describe there, neatly sums up what can happen to a golfer under pressure. I mean, honestly, everything you've said there, and we think about the infamous choking incidences in golfing history, you would say there would be a lot of parallels there. The speeding up, slowing down through overthinking, whether there's avoidance looking, I'm not so sure, perhaps not so much, but the ironic process is the work of the late, great Daniel Wegner. Don't think of a polar bear, I think, was a lot of his research, right? And as you said, I mean, the gaze control has been something quite heavily researched in putting in golf.
Yeah.
So absolutely fascinating. And that leads us neatly onto chapter 2, where, what do you start to, well, how do we take control during that pressure experience?
Yes.
Talk to us. I mean, immediately my mind as a sports psychologist immediately goes, come on, we need some routines here. But tell us a little bit about chapter 2.
Yeah. So how do you control this pressure? And I mean, the whole book obviously is
Yeah.
about that. How can you get to some level of control over yourself, your anxiety, your thoughts, the situation? How can you do this individually? How can you get help from your teammates, your coaches? That's a separate chapter, but for this chapter we talk about individually how you can do that. And it's tricky because this is an event that is known for having a lack of control. Like you don't have control. So many people in football will talk about the penalty shootout as a lottery. Lottery where the chance element plays a big role. Now that is of course wrong, because there's so much you can do in this event, but they're also a little bit right, because a penalty kick, as opposed to the full game, has more chance element, that there's more things that is down to luck or bad luck than it is when it comes to the regular game. Just a simple thing like if you take the type of shot where you have decided beforehand that I'm going to shoot in the left or the right corner, and you basically take aim and you go for that corner, if the goalkeeper happens to go in the right direction, then your chance of scoring is less than 60%. If the goalkeeper goes in another direction, and this is something you cannot control as a penalty taker, right? Then your chance of scoring is way above 90%. So it's more than 30% difference in your outcome just based on something that you have no control over. So, by definition, almost, you don't have full control over this, which is why it's so important to do whatever you can to obtain control. Psychologically, it's, I mean, imperative that you have a perception of some type of control. Now, what do you do for that? The first bit is it helps to be really good at taking penalties. You can't get away from that. There are specialists out there who always score. They have a 90+% rate of scoring, which is 10% more than the average, which is about 80. So if you're a specialist, that's a good starting point, which means you should be building skill. Now that can also be done in multiple ways. We've seen Harry Kane, for example, is of course one of the proponents of the specialist approach to this. Over many years has been a great goalkeeper independent penalty kicker, where he has decided beforehand which corner to go for, puts his head down, his eyes down at the ball, and just goes for that corner. And with that, he scores about 90% of the times. Then you have a Lewandowski, the Polish striker, who uses the opposite technique. He uses the goalkeeper dependent technique, where you have not decided beforehand where to shoot. So essentially, what he has been doing is he steps up to the ball, he lifts his foot to kick it, and he still has not decided where to shoot the ball. The goalkeeper makes the first move. If the goalkeeper goes left, then Lewandowski rolls the ball simply into the right. Now that's, if you think about it, psychologically, pressure-wise, to kick the ball in less than half a second, but you still don't know where. The pressure, the stress in that moment is so huge. Now he has perfected this technique, of course, to pieces. But when I speak to him, and I spoke to him, I had the opportunity to have an afternoon with Lewandowski where we spoke about this and many other things. But what he would say, among many things, was that for him, it's about training, but not just training the skill. It's so much about training the mind. It's so much about how can you control yourself at this moment, having a routine, attend to my breathing, taking time, being in control of the situation. And that's what all of these players will tell you, that they spend time on how to approach it with respect to what they can control, because that's what you want to focus on. So it's the same with Lewandowski, it's the same with Haaland, I spoke with him, it's the same with Martin Ødegaard, I spoke with him, Martin Mjelde, the Chelsea player. They're all talking about the same. They have routines, they have things that they focus on, things they want to do. And if you focus on that, then you at least do something about what you can do, and then the outcome will be whatever it is, but you've done your part.
I'd love to hone in a little bit more on the Lewandowski and the Kane. I've got two separate questions to do with Lewandowski and Harry Kane. And actually, as you were speaking there and you were talking about the way Lewandowski approaches penalties, it's that split-second decision based on what he's seeing from the goalkeeper. So as you describe, a goalkeeper-dependent technique. I mean, your other passion in this area is the perceptual cognitive side of things. So when you talk about, and I don't know if you had this conversation with Lewandowski, he's talking about training the mind and taking control and what have you, but does he also talk about training the cognitive side? Not that he would necessarily use that term, but just the visual perceptual, the pattern recognition of goalkeepers. Did he talk about that at all?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Because the whole conversation about this was around his penalty taking technique. He described in detail how he would change it, because In the beginning of his career, he would always just decide on the corner, but then he realized that he didn't have full control of what the goalkeeper was doing. So there were kicks where he would perform almost optimally, but he was up against a Manuel Neuer, for example, who would have such a good shot stopping technique that the shot still didn't go in, and Lewandowski couldn't live with that. So then it came to a point in May 2016 where he just had trained for months, and now he just rolled out his new technique. And this technique was with him since then. And goalkeepers, for some reason, they were never on to him. So he had like 7-8 years where they would just go to the wrong corner every single time, and he would score a lot of goals on penalties. So this was all about that, but he's still playing, right? And this is a competitive advantage for him, how to do this. And he's now very mindful of this. And as some people may have seen, Lewandowski, as has Kane, by the way, they have changed up their style a little bit the past few years. So both of these players are now starting to alternate technique. So Lewandowski, he's not always using this technique now. There was one game in the Champions League, I think a couple of years ago, where he got 2 penalty kicks. The first penalty kick, he used a goalkeeper dependent kick, and the second one, he used a goalkeeper independent kick because he wants to stay unpredictable. So that's all of that. But back to your question. So I asked him, of course, this. I asked him 5 times exactly what do you think about, what do you attend to, what part of the goalkeeper movement are you looking at, and so forth. And 5 times he was dancing around this question, and he did not answer it. So no, he did not give away what he felt was the core secret to this.
That will be your sequel book when he's retired.
Yes.
Guy, and he's willing to share it, or he might sell the
Yeah,
secret
I don't know.
actually for a substantial amount of money. And look, my second question there is interesting. You said Harry Kane now moves things around in terms of goalkeeper dependent and goalkeeper independent, and you mentioned there being goalkeeper independent. I was going to ask you, to break rule number 1 as a sports psychologist, to perhaps make an assumption here or provide an opinion. Harry Kane obviously famously or infamously missed the second penalty he took in the last World Cup quarterfinal against France, and happened to be up against his teammate at the time, Hugo Lloris. Any opinion, thoughts, feelings on that situation? Because, as you say, enormously successful as a penalty taker. Scored the first one, and then the second one was, I'd like to think I'm a rational-minded Englishman, but I thought it was a poor penalty.
Yeah, no, well, he struck it way above the crossbar again, right? And very atypical for Harry
Yeah.
Kane, who's usually extremely secure in this situation. I've analyzed that penalty to pieces, looking for any type of clues, any type of signs. Was there a hesitation in his run up? Was there a slight deviation in his pre-shot routine in any way? And honestly, I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find any kind of behavioral indication that something was wrong. With that said, Harry Kane is one of the players who, I mean, in the book, I have a sequence where I describe his penalty pre-shot routine in, I think, 2015. Very detailed description. And then I describe his penalty pre-shot routine in 2023. Very detailed, and it's exactly the same. He's been doing exactly the same now for almost a decade. So it's so polished, right? This is it's such a natural part of it's so automatic and natural part of him that I don't think he would give away anything in his behaviors. Now, with that said, after now what seems to be half a lifetime of penalty shootout research, one thing that kind of is like I guess a macro finding or a consistent finding across all these studies is that when there's something extra happening in this situation, when there's something extra to relate to consider, an extra element of pressure, an extra element of disruption, distraction, that's always in the favor of the goalkeeper, never in the favor of the penalty taker. So when you have your teammate in the goal, and there will be an extra element of He knows what I'm thinking. He's been the goalkeeper for hundreds of penalty kicks in practice. There's that little extra thing, and that might be enough to kind of get his thoughts 1 centimeter off at exactly the wrong moment, and that ball goes over the bar instead of under the bar, is my speculation when it comes to that.
Well, it's a wonderful segue to move on to chapter 3, which is actually speaking to that, exploiting the pressure, the goalkeeper viewpoint. I know in this chapter you talk about goalkeeper techniques, around about 10 of them, in order to exploit the pressure that the penalty taker is experiencing. And then you go on to talk about ways to cope, ways penalty takers can cope with that situation. So you've given us a thought there already, but talk us through a couple of ideas that you introduced to the reader in this chapter.
Yeah, so this chapter is more goalkeeper centered.
Yes.
Because it's really about what goalkeepers, as of relatively recently, have started really incorporating as a natural part of their repertoire, if you want, of trying to disrupt the penalty taker, trying to disturb, distract, get off balance, using different types of means. Now, historically, which is interesting, and this is also a big part of the book, we've done very detailed analysis of penalty kicks from the beginning of shootouts, which was in 1970. That was the very, very first penalty shootout, and up until today. So it's 50 years of penalty kicks. And in the 70s, goalkeepers were so well behaved. They were standing still, stationary. They were even making themselves as small as possible, it seemed, on the goal line, doing exactly what the referee was telling them to do. And fast forward to today, and that's not at all the case. And there's been a gradual progression in this, and I track this. I even have a diagram in the book showing how it went from about 5% of the goalkeepers back then would do anything to kind of disrupt the penalty taker. And then gradually more and more and more and more until today, we're up to above 60%. 65% of goalkeepers will do something to kind of distract or disturb. And there's so many techniques, from the visual techniques, dancing on the goal line, turning your back to the penalty taker, taking pirouettes, the technique I call gardening, which is basically scuffing up the penalty mark, which we've seen more and more, confronting the penalty taker on the penalty spot, like we spoke about with David Beckham earlier. Grabbing hold of ball possession is a big one. Dominating space in different ways in the penalty area. Verbal disruption, of course, the good old trash talk, which is often combined with all these other techniques. And then you have different types of deception, where you're making deceptive movements on the line to try to get the penalty taker off track. Positioning a little bit skewed in the goal, not so much that the penalty taker will consciously detect that you're standing skewed in the goal, but just enough that you will subconsciously do that, which will increase the chance that you as a penalty taker will shoot to the slightly larger area of the goal. And then, run up interference, which we see now, delay, which is a big thing, where you're delaying your approach into the goal. And our statistics clearly show that if you're able to delay your approach to the goal line so that the referee will delay his or her whistle, and the penalty taker is standing there with no control, but they have to wait, not because they want to wait, but they have to wait, then performance progressively declines the longer you have to stand there as a penalty taker. So all these types of techniques, these goalkeepers have become quite sophisticated at producing. I describe a series of them in the book.
Using behaviors to take charge of the situation in order to exploit that pressure. One from my own memory bank, and if you're sort of my age, probably a little bit older as well, a famous one from the 1980s would be former Liverpool goalkeeper Bruce Grobbelaar and the wobbly knees from 1984 against Roma.
Yes.
which must have been possibly one of the first ever televised cases of a goalkeeper doing something quite extravagant. And obviously,
He was. I call him a pioneer in the book kick, because
Yeah,
he
yeah.
was definitely the first one who really did something elaborate. There's been, little flirtations with this before that, but he took it all the way, and of course in a very high stakes game in the European Cup final, and that ended up probably, or at least possibly, contributing to Liverpool's win. So that was a historical moment for goalkeepers.
And I guess that means that this becomes so much more of a team affair. It's if we think about teamwork in football, we don't necessarily immediately associate penalty kicks as a moment for teamwork. This is actually what you're then suggesting in the next chapter, is that because that goalkeeper it's a highly pressured situation, the goalkeeper can exploit that situation with all kinds of extraordinary behaviours, and teammates of goalkeepers can do that. So your teammates, as a penalty taker, your teammates can help you. So this next chapter, you talk about this really being a team moment. Can you dig a little bit deeper for penalty kicks as team moments?
Yeah, so exactly. I mean, we're used to thinking logically, naturally about a penalty kick as an individual task in the team sport of football. And of course, it is, in the sense that there's one player who's ultimately trying to transport the ball into the goal. There's one foot that kicks the ball. But everything leading up to that, there's so much that can be done from a team perspective. So much that, in fact, I'm now looking at this as much more of a team performance or a collective performance than it is an individual performance. And part of it is that you have goalkeepers who are trying to disrupt the penalty taker, but not just goalkeepers, because outfield players are also trying their best to do something with the penalty taker. And one example that I spend a little bit of time on in the book is in the World Cup final in Qatar between France and Argentina, where there were multiple penalties and the penalty shootout. And perhaps the most high pressure kick of them all was in the second half of the extra time. We're 2.5 minutes away from the end. The score is 3-2 to Argentina, and France gets a penalty. And everyone now knows that if France and Mbappe scores on that kick, you have a shot at the World Cup trophy. There will be a penalty shootout. But if he misses, it's out for France. And Mbappe stepping up with that kick, Mbappe who was the only player who missed in a penalty shootout in the Euros just a year ahead of that, and almost quit playing international football because of all the racist fallout and all the crap that he received. He's the one who takes this kick. And so, it's a lose-lose situation. So the pressure on him in this instance is so huge. And the Argentinians knew that. So they have the notorious Emi Martinez in the goal, who's world famous now for his mind games. But the referee also knew about him. So the referee handled Martinez for this kick. But there were three, four, I think even five Argentinian players who were all trying to get to Mbappe. At the same time, they're trying to scuff up the spot. They were trying to talk to him. They were trying to shove him. And if Mbappe did not have teammates who were proactively taking charge, so basically, he literally had bodyguards in this situation, people who protected him, who physically would push the Argentinian players away. And Mbappe would just stand there in the middle. I'm not going to say he was calm, because I don't think he was calm, but at least he was relatively undisturbed by these Argentinian players. And if he had been there on his own, there's no way he would have been able to do that. And that's a trend in football now. I interviewed players for the book who would say that we go into a game now and we have maybe two, maybe three assigned penalty takers, and we have two or three assigned penalty taker protectors. And that's what they call it. So we have two or three players who always need to be on duty protecting the penalty taker for whatever is happening in the moment from their opponents. And we've seen so many examples of that. Also, we've seen the decoy that some teams now are using, where you have one player who grabs the ball, but that's not the real penalty taker. The real penalty taker is hiding in the periphery, preparing quietly for the shot. You have supportive structures you can use in a penalty shootout. You have the goalkeepers who can hand you the ball always to make sure that you get the ball from a friendly person leading up to your shot in the penalty shootout. Some goalkeepers even make this into a 2 versus 1 situation because they then walk with the penalty taker into the penalty area with their friend against the opposition's goalkeeper, effectively making it a two versus one. And then you have all the things, and I describe a lot of this in the book. We're not going to take the time for that now, but how you stand in the mid circle, how you support teammates in the mid circle, what you do with teammates who miss their shots, how you get them back into the group again. Yeah, essentially, this is a team performance, and I think we should treat it as such.
Well, if I may just briefly ask, at the end, you mentioned supporting missing, and obviously a penalty can be missed during a game, and a penalty can be missed in a penalty shootout. And I always remember, I'm blessed to know Chris Powell. I've worked with him, English coach, worked closely with him at a club in the past. And at the time of the Euros final, when England lost on the penalty kicks to Italy, and Bukayo Saka missed the penalty, and subsequently got horrendous grief on social media for that, just awful. But I always remember the images of Bukayo being just Chris Powell actually just standing with him after the game, just being there for him. And just how wonderfully comforting that would have been for Saka at that time. So just in terms of how players, people can help others deal with misses. You address that a little bit in this chapter?
Yeah, I definitely do. Because this uh, and the Saka story is a more difficult one than others because Saka's kick obviously was the last kick,
Yes,
and so at that point it was too
yes,
late. Um, but I've seen other really nice examples of that too. We talked about Kane earlier, and I found the way that Jordan Henderson was standing with Kane when he had missed that shot against France and England was out of the World Cup. I found that beautiful, and the way he did that, Jordan Henderson was, he was just like casually just standing next to Kane. It wasn't, not to say anything, not to have the wisest words of wisdom at the moment, but just being there, hanging out with him, being in his vicinity, which is very deliberate. And some people will do that. They will, of course, go ahead and who's the person here now who needs the most support? That's person X. Okay, I'm going to be going to person X and I'm going to try to help person X. So that's that part of it. But even more interesting, I think, is what happens during a penalty shootout. We know that almost 60% of penalty shootouts are won by a team who has missed at least one shot. This means that if you miss a shot, it's not over. It's not likely, but it's still very possible that you will end up winning. So it's about how do you, as a team, recover from that miss. And the first thing that you can do is to show the player who missed and show the other players in your team that when one of us misses, we take care of that person. And to put that a little bit cynically, it's not really about helping the player who missed. It's about helping the others because the player who missed, it's too late for that player.
yeah,
But it's showing that as a team, we're standing up for that player. And this is something that we've seen now relatively recently. That in the World Cup when Argentina missed a penalty in the quarterfinal against the Netherlands, there was one player who walked over to that player, walked out of the mid circle, and made sure that the player who had missed got back into the circle, and that was Lionel Messi. And for France in the final, there were two misses for France. There was one player again who walked out of the mid circle to get those two players back into the group again, and that was Kylian Mbappe. So these superstars, they're not just the most skillful players. They're also now more and more of them leaders in this situation. And I started working on this back in 2007, actually, when I did work. I mentioned that earlier with Dutch teams and the Dutch Federation. So the Dutch under 21 team, when they went into the penalty shootout or the European Championships first in 2007, that they ended up winning at the end, but they had to go through a penalty shootout against England in the semi-final. A penalty shootout that went to 32 penalties in total, 16 for each team. And there were multiple misses on both sides. And we had worked beforehand with the team on when we miss, what do we do? And the big thing was just we need to get the guy who missed back into the group again as soon as possible. And the team did that every time. And when I or my students spoke to the team, we did interviews with all the players afterward just to kind of evaluate what worked and what did not work of the interventions that we had done. And this was one of the things that they lifted as particularly helpful, to have a plan for when we miss, because it's about recovering from that miss to ultimately increase your chance of winning the shootout.
It's fascinating stuff. It's embodying team cohesion, social cohesion, task cohesion. It's modeling positive responses, isn't it? That's absolutely fantastic. Now, in the next chapter, I mean, we're reversing up here, and we're talking about preparation, preparing to take penalties. In essence, training for pressure, training for that pressure moment of the penalty kicks. And as a sports psychologist over the years, and this is probably in multiple sports, you do get people who sort of look at you somewhat skeptically, maybe even cynically, and say, well, you can't replicate the pressure, so let's not even bother. I'm sure you weave a different story in this chapter. So talk to me a little bit about training for the pressure of taking penalties.
Yeah, no, I do advocate a different point of view.
Yeah,
This is true. Not surprisingly. No, yes, it's can you train it? Every single penalty taker, specialist penalty taker that I've spoken with, and I've asked them the question of basically, why are you so good at taking penalties? And they all say the same thing: it's practice. I practice, and they say it in different ways, but it's a very consistent story. They practice, some of them every single day, all of them every week, standing behind, taking maybe one shot, maybe three shots, not necessarily a whole series of shots, but just a little bit of practice regularly. So that part of it is very clear. Now, can you replicate the pressure of a Euros final penalty shootout? Well, the answer is probably that you can't replicate it 100%. So those who say that will be right in that sense, but they will be wrong if they conclude that because we can't replicate it 100%, we should not train it. Because if you can train it if you can replicate some of it, if you can simulate a part of it, as multiple studies have shown on this, if you can train with mild anxiety, you will prepare yourself more effectively for performing under high anxiety. So you don't have to replicate it 100%, because if you have a little bit of it present in training, then that's enough for you to feel it a little bit. It's enough for you to train your protocol, your routine. It's enough for you to kind of get a little bit of sense out of what's happening. And this is something that will help you when you get there. And there's now, I mean, there's a lot of studies now on the effects of simulation training, which this basically is, and there are so many studies on it that you have reviews of it and you have meta-analysis on it, and the conclusions are quite clear that simulation training will help. It will, of course, not be bulletproof. It doesn't mean that if you only train, you will always win. It's not like that, never. But it will always increase the chance of you doing more of the right thing when you get to it. And that's really what sports is about, and penalty shootouts are no exception.
The 2020 Canadian Women's Olympics team?
Yes. So I have a case study in this chapter. Though I mean, there are a lot of cases in this book, and the Canada team was interesting because in the Olympics, 2020 Olympics, they ended up with the gold medal, and they really did that from penalties. In the quarterfinal, they beat Brazil in the penalty shootout. In the semifinal, they got a late penalty kick against the US, and they scored that and got to the final. In the final, they got another late penalty kick. They scored that. The game went to a penalty shootout, and they won that. So they won on penalties. And this is a team that had practiced penalties. They had a protocol for penalties. They had a very detailed plan for penalties that they had been rehearsing for 8 years. For 8 years. And they had never been able to use it because they never got to an important moment in the tournament where they can use this plan. And this is part of the reason why so many teams don't do it. But the Canadians, they stuck to it. They took out their plan. And I mean, I described the full story and the details of what they did in the book, but it's essentially a case study of the effect of practice over time.
The final chapter delves into, in essence, what coaches and managers can do in and around penalty shootouts. I'd love to know a little bit about this because I know they're such an essential part of this, but tell us how you break down their role and responsibility and how they can positively influence that crucial pressure moment.
Yeah, I mean that this is probably honestly my favorite chapter because this is
Save the best for last.
yeah, because this is but also because it's a slightly different chapter. The other chapters are very heavy with research, my own and others. There's a lot of data on it. Um, Many people have studied penalty kicks. I mean, in total, I saw someone do a review on this, and they claimed that there were 300 studies out there on penalty kicks in football, which is a lot of research. I haven't quoted all these 300 in the book, but I've touched on quite a few of them. But this last chapter, there's not that much research on this because what this is you have a team, you're a manager, you're a coach, you have a team, you get to a penalty shootout, you gather your team in maybe a huddle or some type of gathering, and you know that you now have 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, to impact these players positively before they go into what may be the most important situation to take the most important kick in their whole life. You have 2 minutes. What do you do? What do you say? I mean, how do you behave in this situation? And going into this has been fascinating. I did a very in-depth case study of all the penalty shootouts in the Qatar World Cup. By some stroke of luck, I got access to video footage from that World Cup from 5 different camera angles, uninterrupted video footage. So I basically know everything that happened in these penalty shootouts from these videos. There were 5 penalty shootouts, and in this chapter, I share the conclusions and the details from this, and to talk about some of that now, just briefly. The first thing I found is that in the penalty shootout in 2022, and it's going to be the same in 2024, no one is short on physiological support, meaning they all have plenty of water, they all have plenty of massages. There's so much nutritional supplements. Some of these players had 2 people massaging them at once. So the physical side of this is very well taken care of. Now, the psychological side is a very different story altogether, and the contrasts are so massive. You have teams, and I have to single out some of these teams, and some of them are with us in the tournament also this summer. The French team. So obviously there was a final between France and Argentina, ended in a shootout. The French team and the Champs, they're known for, or the Champs has become known for refusing to train penalties because it is a lottery. You cannot simulate the pressure. Now you can see that too when the Champs gathers his team because he does not have a plan. He does not know who to ask. He does not know what players to select. So he spends the majority of his 2 minutes walking around the huddle looking for players that he might ask, scanning, we used that word earlier, scanning his team for who might be up for taking a penalty kick. So there were some of the players that he ended up asking where it took 20 to 25 seconds just the process for him locating the player that he wanted to ask before he asked. The contrast to Scaloni on the other side of the pitch is huge. He knew exactly what to do. It took him less than 15 seconds to tell 5 players that they were the penalty takers. And then he moved on to basically give more of an emotional message to the group. And in fact, of the 10 penalty shootouts, what we found was when we did a very simple thing, we basically just timed how long did each team take to give tactical instructions to the team. The pattern was very clear. The 5 teams who took the shortest time in the penalty shootout to give instructions, those were the 5 teams who ended up winning the penalty shootout. And why is that? Well, it's a case study, so we have to be, of course, very careful to conclude too much. But if we're speculating on what could be a reason for this to happen, it could be that the 5 teams who took the shortest time, they took short time because they were prepared, because they knew what to do. They didn't have to think about or discuss with their assistants what they wanted to do, and that could be the reason why this pattern kind of emerged. So that's just a little teaser really into some of the things we looked at. But in addition, I mean, I describe here the communication pattern, the degree of directness, the way some coaches, i.e. the winning coaches in these shootouts, were all practicing eye contact and direct connection. Whereas, with no exceptions, the coaches who ended up losing these shootouts, they all had pieces of paper and they had their heads buried in their pieces of paper, losing that direct connection with their team. And there are many other things that we discuss here, and I just find this a really interesting way to study management under high pressure, because that's what this is at the end of the day.
Well, I think it's fascinating, and listening to you as a sports psychology consultant who gets the opportunity to work behind the scenes at clubs and I've worked with international teams as well. It makes me think of the importance of language, behavioral norms, leadership protocols, processes within coaching practice, all these sort of what have historically been considered softer areas, if you like, as opposed to the tech physical side of things, but the kind of the glue that can bring the biopsychosocial glue that brings it all together. And I'd like you to close things out, sort of talk to us a little bit about how you conclude the book and how you sort of see the past sort of 50 years of penalty taking, because I know that that's what you do at the end of the book, and you summarize things. And for me, listening to you there, and perhaps to lend towards your conclusion, I think there's a really interesting dynamic with English football around penalties, in as much as, and I don't want to say the wrong thing here because I haven't been involved with the English Football Association on this side of things, but I know the wonderful work that's been done with Gareth Southgate and his coaching staff, firstly by Pippa Grange, who's been on the Sports Psych show, and then the great work of Ian Mitchell, so Dr. Pippa Grange, Dr. Ian Mitchell, around this area, as well as other people like Owen Eastwood. These people have combined to change the narrative of the probably across the whole international setup, but certainly of penalties. My understanding, speaking to you spoke about Didier Deschamps there, and his attitude, the narrative, the story there being, well, it's luck, it's a game of chance, right? And my understanding was that tended to be the narrative, the story, the language historically with England and penalty kicks, until Gareth and the Sykes and others intervened and said, no, we're going to change that narrative. We're going to practice. We're going to have routines. We're going to practice under pressure. We're actually going to change this to, this is about competence and skill. Yes, there's always going to be an element of luck, as you've described, but this is about competence and skill. And so subsequently, we're not perfect. We're lost in the Euros in the penalty fight, but we've won some penalty kicks, whereas before, boy, I think we were honestly up there with the worst in the world, with the greatest of respect. So, no question, just I suppose backing up what you're saying about the French team there and Didier Deschamps with respect to him, but also how do you conclude things here?
Yeah, no, I love your thoughts on this, and it's I think the bigger theme here for me is really that this uh, I mean the game as such for me, and I know for you, is psychological. It's really a psychological game, and it comes perhaps better across or clearer across than for the overall game when you study something as simple. Again, it's not simple, but clear as a penalty shootout, because this is clearly a psychological game, and to win it at least consistently, you need to approach it as such. And to get there, I'm fully with you. It's about changing the narrative of what this is. It's not a lottery, and it's also not only a skills game, because it's about how do you cope at this moment? How do you handle the stress individually, as a team, as a coaching staff, as the manager? It's all connected, and this is where it becomes a very dynamic, fluid, and complex endeavor. And you have to understand this context. And I feel like maybe if this book really contributes with something, it's setting the context. Like the context is very it's described in all its detail, psychologically, cognitively, emotionally, socially, and I think you need to start with that. And at the end of the book, I came to this actually very strong realization, that was unexpected for me, that I would get there, because I hadn't thought like that before, and that is that we as a sport, we as a community, in football, I strongly feel that for 50 years now we've sacrificed our players with the penalty shootout. And what I mean by that is that we have sent our players into battle, almost literally speaking, with no preparation, with no techniques, with no training, with no support. We haven't equipped them with what they need to handle this particular situation. And I'm not now talking about a specific coach or a specific team or a federation. This is football as such. And I can just as well point the gun at myself, that we all should have done more and better to help these players at least have something that they can kind of try to do to cope better with this situation. And I'm not saying that, uh, you know, uh, I don't want misses to happen in a penalty shootout, because that will always happen. Players will always make mistakes and they will always fail. But I really, really hope that those days are over when players go into this shootout and they have no idea what to do, because no one has taught them, no one has shown them, no one has supported them, no one has helped them set up proper training. I mean, really, honestly, we have to be done with that, and the way to do that properly is to approach it psychologically, and that's really what this book is about in all its different dimensions.
Fantastic, Guy. Thank you so much for this. The book is called Pressure: Lessons for the Psychology of the Penalty Shootout. How can people find you, follow you, and purchase this book, most importantly?
Yeah, well, they find me on Twitter or X. I'm on LinkedIn. I have an account on Instagram, but I'm not so active. I may put out more and more there. And the book, I mean, hopefully they'll find it in bookstores. It's on Amazon, probably on most online bookstores. There's an audiobook. I spent a few days in London reading the audiobook which was a special experience. So, yeah, it should be available for everyone to find.
Fantastic. Guy, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that episode, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.